Okay, so then it would be fair to say that the principle of parsimony doesn't necessarily limit theoretical commitments. It's just when we know that we can explain the same stuff with the same effectiveness, we just don't need to postulate more commitments. However, and right now I want to explore schools of theistic apologetics, which might pose some challenges, and I'm interested at how you are going to respond to them. So one somewhat popular argumentation that is becoming, somewhat popular on internet and on some, Discord debates is, I don't know whether you are acquainted with this, a form of transcendental argument, which says that, well, actually, theism has a better explanatory depth when it comes to accounting for the transcendentals. That is the set of principles that work as preconditions of knowledge. So the transcendental argument, as I understanding, goes on to suggest that, well, we have all those presuppositions that are necessary for intelligibility, such as, space, time, number system, laws of logic, properly basic beliefs. And, naturalism is sterile when it comes to justifying or accounting for the unity of those transcendentals or preconditions of knowledge, whereas theism wins because it can account for the universality and validity of those transcendentals by pointing to the idea that God is who officiates the validity and universality of those transcendentals. I think that is the summary of this school of apologetics. And what is your reaction to it? Have you ever encountered
So,
this the presuppositionalism, or are you aware of it?
I'm not really familiar with it, but I don't see how you're going to get more theoretical unity out of um, making an extra assumption, the assumption that there's God, right? There's going in your theory, there's going to be a whole. So let's start with the naturalist. Um, Perhaps the naturalist has to postulate some primitives here. So maybe, for example, it's a primitive in the theory that there's a spatiotemporal universe. So you've got space and time as primitive concepts in the formulation of the claim that there's the spatiotemporal universe. And then it may be that you've got um, some theory about space and some theory about time, and we can imagine that you can axiomatize your theory of space, so that there'll be some bunch of principles about space and there'll be some bunch of principles about time, from which all of your knowledge about space or all your knowledge about time can be recovered. Now let's suppose we go to the theist. Are they going to be able to compress those theories of space and time? I don't see how. The best that they'll be able to do is to say God wanted these principles to apply, or something like that. You can't unify the principle further without actually just being able to move to a particular axiom set than the one that the naturalist has already got. So I'm just completely sceptical that there's any affordance of unity that you can get out of a postulation of God. And there are costs, because there's all these properties that you're going to be assigning to God that the naturalist juxtaposes aren't instantiated. Is that Does that make sense?
So I think that from what I listened, what they're trying to establish is um, that they have a form of justification for the universal validity of the preconditions of knowledge. So they would ask a question like, well, how do you know that the principle of identity or non-contradiction hold in all places and in all times? You can't know that because you do not have access to the, you don't believe in God, and for example, God would necessitate or would account for the universal validity of laws of logic and of the other transcendentals that are necessary for us to be for the world, for us to be intelligible. So, what would be your response to that?
So it's an interesting question, isn't it? Amongst logicians, there are paraconsistentists who deny that there's a law of non-contradiction. They accept that there's a range of cases in which contradictions should be rejected, but they also think there are cases where there are true contradictions and you should tolerate them. And although this is less common, there are people who think that you should reject the law of identity as well. Again, just like with contradictions, for the most part, violations of the law are a bad thing, of the alleged law are a bad thing, but there are cases where you should just tolerate. Suppose there are exceptions to the law of identity. Now, what to say about this, right? If the paraconsistentists are right, then there is no such thing as a universal law of non-contradiction.
Okay.
And likewise, if a tiny number of people who think that there's no universal law of identity, the same thing is going to apply. What I think we do with these cases is they're part of the theory, and we assess them in the same way as everything else. We see what you need in order to make best theory that explains all the data, minimising your commitment. And so I think that it's kind of up in the air whether it's even true that we know that there are no true contradictions.
But is it mandatory for us to know that laws of logic are universal and universally true in order for us to claim intelligibility or in order for us to claim knowledge?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Kids claim knowledge without any knowledge about the laws of logic.
But I guess
there's no problem about being justified in claiming knowledge without having any insight into logic. The kid knows that there's a squirrel in the tree, and they've got no idea about modus ponens. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I guess the way they conceive is that those laws of logic are laws of thought, as in a form of metaphysical laws that are, that are ingrained in your mind, as in laws that cannot be violated, or laws that are there even if you know about them or not. It's what make knowledge possible, or cognitive, or reliable cognitive processes possible in the first place. It's not how you view logic. What is the nature of those three fundamental laws? Are they actually constitutive laws of mind or laws of thought?
I don't. There's a lot going on here. And one question is about whether there are necessities of some kind, whether, for example, in your theory, you're going to have to hold that certain things are necessary. And I'm quite happy to go along with that. But I don't think that the determination about what necessities are going to be built into your theory is something that's arrived at a priori. It's just part of the process of theory construction. It's arrived at a posteriori. So I guess that's one part of the answer. On the question about whether there are laws of thought, that seems, I don't know, in some sense maybe there are. Laws of thought that could be mundane things like this. Don't think about things unless you have to. Don't clutter your mind with trivial stuff. Right? There should be some purpose to your thinking. Right? That could be a law of thought.
But
and in some sense,
non-contradiction
then
is not.
that would have a kind of universality, right? You can't really make sense of the idea of there being an evolved organism that wastes its resources on things that are of no consequence to it. Right. So what I've got in mind here is logic tells you that anything that's a logical consequence of something that's true is itself true. So we can start with raining. It's true that it's raining. Well, it's true that it's true that it's raining. True that it's true that it's true that it's raining. I can go on forever, and I'm producing a whole lot of truths, but it's a complete waste of time, right? So the law of thought would tell you, don't do that,
Okay.
right? Even though it's a law of logic that whatever follows from what's true, whatever is the logical consequence of what's true is itself true.
Okay.
So the idea that there's some connection between laws of thought and logic strikes me as quite a bizarre thing. I mean, there's a whole lot of rules you might think of for directing thought.
But
They
those.
aren't logic. They aren't rules of logic.
Right. So the way I understand laws of logic is that they're laws that govern propositions or sentences that have truth value. So what I encounter is that when people speak about law of identity, well, A equals A, they sometimes, consciously or unconsciously, talk about that law as if it is a law of physics. Namely, well, can stone be a non-stone, or it's as if they're talking about an actual stone not being able to be its negation. But what does law of identity actually cover? What it is a law of? That would be my question.
Right. So I guess the right way to think about this is to think about logic. So what's a formal logical system? In particular, think about predicate calculus with identity, because then you can kind of start to make sense of what identity's for. So in the predicate calculus with identity, typically you have three axioms that give you reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity for identity. So for any x is x, for any x and y, if x is y, then y is x, for any x, y, and z, if x is y and y is z, then x is z, right, where the isn't there or all isn't of identity. Now, you might think that you need more for identity than that, but at least from the standpoint of the sort of logic with identity, that's what you've got. And there's a question about domain to which this logic applies, but any domain to which it applies will be one where you don't have violations of those laws.
So then you wouldn't say that the universal validity of those three laws of logic is something that we necessarily have to account in order for us to have reliable sense data. This is not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that your ability to perceive the world really doesn't depend on your having any theory about identity.
So the presuppositionalism say that no, of course you do have a reliable sense data, well, because those laws are in action, officiated by God. It's just you don't realize or recognize it, or you don't want to recognize it. But if I then proceed to ask you to justify those preconditions of knowledge, then you wouldn't be able to, because non-God worldview cannot justify for the preconditions of knowledge, because then it would be circular or question begging or self-defeating.
So it seems as though if you really want to push in this direction, all you have to say is that there couldn't possibly be violations of laws, right? These are just necessary truths.
Again, I didn't catch it again.
A way to go, and then that won't be problematic.
Okay, that would be problematic for the naturalism.
I don't see how it could be problematic, right? There's this question about the accounting if we're thinking about simplicity and we're thinking about, in particular, the theoretical simplicity, which you think about is maybe in terms of the compactness of axiomatization, there's going to be no difference in the compactness of the axiomatization of the two theories. It's not like a theory that's got God in it somehow gets to do away with having as a primitive reflexivity for identity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't want to spend much time with it. It's just, there is this idea that in order for you to, well, since you think that, one purpose of metaphysical theory is to have explanatory depth, then it should probably also account for transcendentals or for the preconditions of knowledge. And then the idea goes that, well, naturalism cannot account for the universal validity of preconditions, and theism can, by pointing that, well, the God did it, basically.
Right, but that it's not clear that how the God did it's got anything to do with it's necessary that anything's identical to itself. Right. If you think that's necessary, then it seems to me nothing does it. Necessity is a kind of rock bottom. If I tell you that something's necessary and you ask me, but why? You're kind of missing the point, right? Because what's necessary is so no matter what, nothing could have made it otherwise. So in particular, it doesn't need God to make it so.
And do we know, so would you say that we know that principle of identity is necessary or universally valid, or is it, undeniable?
Well, okay, so this depends now, right? That was why I started by talking about paraconsistency, right? Because there's this question, right, about whether actually we know those things or not. Right? That's a live dispute amongst philosophers. But let's pretend that we do know it. Then fine. There's nothing tricky to explain here. If we know it, it's because it's necessary. If it's necessary, there's nothing further to say to explain it because it couldn't have been otherwise.
Okay, so it could, yeah. Is it true that those three fundamental laws of logic are in action when day-to-day conversations are happening? So when my mother is asking me to bring her water, is there a principle of identity involved in that somewhere? Can we say that the principle of identity covers that the meaning of water that she has in mind, that I have in mind, should be identical to itself, or without that the communication would be impossible, or those laws of logic have nothing to do with that?
I'm not sure. So, I mean, that particular example is interesting. So there are some people who think that when you and I communicate, we actually don't have exactly the same concept, and the words that we use don't have exactly the same meanings. But there's enough overlap that we can talk to one another without misunderstanding. And so there's a question about whether your mother's water concept and your water concept are exactly the same or not. Perhaps, a bit more chemistry than she does, and so there's your water concept is richer in various ways than hers. That doesn't stop you from communicating about, bring me a glass of water, but it will make a difference maybe when there are other things that you say when you're talking about water, and she just looks at you blankly and what? Because actually your concepts just aren't the same.
So when she says water, and when I understand this water, there is a reminder left when these two concepts of water are subtracted, but the similarity is enough for me to make that operational. I can basically go and bring the water and she's satisfied. But so
I mean, one way of thinking about this is going along with your use of the word water is a theory about water, and that theory can be more or less complicated. It doesn't have to be if you sort of collect all the people on the planet and you take the intersection of all their concepts of water, it's not empty, right? It could turn out that intersection is empty, it seems to me. But maybe, even if it turns out that it's not, it might turn out to be too thin to sustain conversations. It's, who knows, right? We're talking really about questions that are kind of empirical questions for linguists and
And
psychologists.
to circle back, so what does the principle of identity doing here when someone's telling me to bring them water? What is the purpose of principle of identity? Is it true to say that, well, you need principle of identity in order for you to understand when someone's asking you for water, because water has to be water and not water? Or that's completely
So,
bogus?
so that just seems wrong. When my children were little and I asked them to bring me a glass of water, I knew full well that they had no understanding of quantification theory and the other things that you need to state the laws of identity. No problem. Right?
So
It's not operating in any way in their understanding or in your understanding when all you're doing is saying, bring me the glass of water.
yeah, so this whole idea about laws of logic being some form of metaphysical laws that determine the self-sameness of entities is not a correct theory.
I don't think so. That seems really weird to me.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
as if suspend the operation of the law and things won't be the same as themselves. What are you imagining? What could it possibly be? Right? We're talking about something incoherent here. Okay, so I think that the best way to think about this is to go back to mathematics and think about doing simple mathematical proofs. Very often, if you're kind of formalising your mathematical proof, you'll want to write down things like, for any x is x, right? And then derive a contradiction. You end up with A isn't identical to A, and you've got a contradiction now from because you can get A is identical to A out of the law. So the utility of the talk about identity and the idea that we've got these laws of reflexivity, sensitivity, symmetry is partly in the construction of mathematical proof and then in formal disciplines more generally, because it's not just mathematics, but things that look a bit like mathematics, like game theory, where you do proofs. You're going to need to appeal to these things, and in fact, in metaphysics too. So if you're talking about causation and you think that the causal relation is so actually, the causation is not going to be a good example, but you might pick some other relation that has similar formal properties to identity. So you can do a kind of partition into equivalence relations, and there's all kinds of stuff that you can prove about equivalence relations and so on. That's what the users that talk about identity and the idea that there's a law of identity is. That's what we actually use it for.
If we touch the other ones, the excluded middle, for example, what would you say is the purpose of excluded middle in day-to-day argumentation?
It'll be the same thing. So if you think that you can formalise arguments for and against the existence of God in predicate calculus with identity, or we don't even need identity, we don't even need predicate calculus, we can do it in propositional logic since we're just talking about excluded middle, there'll be cases where in order to formalise your argument, you'll appeal to excluded middle.
Okay.
On the assumption that you and the other people have agreed that we're in a domain where classical logic applies, because it might be that you come up against people who are intuitionists, that they won't accept excluded middle, and in that case there's no point trying to give them an argument that starts with the assumption of excluded middle.
So
yeah. That's kind of important in philosophy of religion if we're talking about infinity, because infinity was the kind of thing that got the whole intuitionist stuff started in the first place.
So what I want to clarify now is that you use the word appeal, and it tells me that your understanding of laws of logic now is different, because when you say appeal to law of excluded middle, therefore it follows that those laws aren't like laws of physics, because so the laws of Newtonian mechanics are in action, whether you appeal to them or not, or whether you recognize they are there and you are subject to them. Laws of logic do not have the same ontological status. It's not that they are there determining your argument, determining your line of thought, the same way laws of physics or chemistry or biology determine you or your.
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, there is the laws of Newtonian mechanics are not really laws. They're kind of rules of thumb that apply in a certain domain. Obviously, they don't apply if things are too small and moving too quickly. There is a question about the universality here. On the scale that we exist at, where you can ignore quantum relativity, then what happens perhaps is in accordance with the laws, but even that's not clear, right? There are people like Nancy Cartwright who would certainly deny that the laws do any determining when it comes to us, and in particular, you have to worry about free will at this point, right? If people have libertarian free will, then there's no determination by law, by physical law of what they do.
So then to rehabilitate my question, the basic forces then, such as electromagnetism, gravity, well, they are definitely in action in order for me to exist, right?
That's certainly true.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the laws of logic do not have to be in action the same way the four basic forces are, in order for me to have a reliable thought.
They couldn't be, because they don't do any governing. I mean, if you think
they don't do any governing.
If you think of the power, if you don't like laws and you talk about powers, right? There are certain powers that have sway. So, electromagnetism, gravity. There's no powers of logic that have sway over the universe.
Right?
That might be a good way to say it.
So those laws are not some laws of metaphysics that govern the, ontological parameters of universe. That's not what they actually are. Okay, because most times in usual debates, those laws are presented as some form of metaphysical absolutes, and I had some form of skepticism towards such, and you seem to justify my skepticism. They are not some metaphysical ground rules. That's not what they are.
I don't think so. I mean, it is true that you're not going to get it. Let's forget about the intuitionists and the paraconsistentists. You're not going to get violations, but it's not because there are powers that are stopping you. It's because it's outright impossible, right? There is no alternative.
Oh, okay.
You don't need anything to ward off impossibilities. Impossibilities simply are not going to happen.
Yeah, what type of impossibility are we talking here? Because there are clearly contradictions that that are meaningful. They are contradictions, but they have meaning, and we can think them. So it's not like law of non-contradiction prevents contradictions to exist. As a matter of fact, in order for us to know that law of non-contradiction exists, we do have to have the capability to recognize that there are, in fact, contradictory statements, or form of self-defeating statements. So you wouldn't say that law of non-contradiction. Yeah.
Okay, so that's true, right? I can write down a proposition that's contradictory. I can write down something that would violate the law of logic.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
That doesn't mean that there are contradictory objects in the world, or that objects instantiate contradictory properties in the world, or anything like that.
Yeah. So yeah, but you can
once you've got logic up and going, right? You formulated the law of non-contradiction. You can formulate instantiations of the law, and you can know that those things are just false.
Okay.